September 21st, 1940. The train stopped. The doors opened. The first thing was the smell. It reached him before he could see anything, before his eyes adjusted to the light outside the train car. Something chemical and burned, and underneath it, something organic and wrong. The kind of smell that registers in the body before the mind can interpret it. Then the noise came. Dogs barking, commands in German, repeated at high volume. The sound of hundreds of men being organized under threat of force, the shuffling of feet, the occasional crack of a baton. They were moved through a gate. They stood in a yard. SS guards walked down the line of new arrivals, quick and businesslike. Everything was taken: coats, shoes, watches, wallets. A man 2 positions from Pilecki tried to hold on to his wedding ring, and a guard hit him across the side of the head until he let it go. They were taken inside, stripped completely, shaved. Pilecki stood naked in a room full of naked men who had not chosen to be there. Lawyers and farmers and teachers and factory workers, all reduced to the same thing in under an hour. Then came the tattoos. A prisoner in a striped uniform moved down the line with a needle. Each man's forearm was held still. A number was drawn in permanent ink into the skin. Pilecki's number was 4859. He stood in the yard of Auschwitz in his prison uniform. Around him, hundreds of men in identical uniforms looked at the same fences, the same guard towers, the same grey buildings. He could not yet see everything the camp contained. He could see enough. He could feel the weight of the place pressing on every person inside it. He had 48 hours before the first round of executions. He needed to identify at least one person he could trust before that. He began to look. Spring of 1942, Auschwitz. Pilecki was standing in the yard when the train started arriving. Not the trains that had been coming since 1940, carrying Polish prisoners and Soviet officers. Something different. These trains were coming from France, from the Netherlands, from Greece, from Hungary. The carriages were sealed. When the doors were opened, people fell out who had been standing pressed against each other for days with no water, no food, no air. Children, elderly men, women carrying infants, entire families who had been told they were being resettled. They were sorted on the platform immediately. An SS doctor walked down the line and pointed, left or right. Those on the right went to the barracks. Those on the left were told they would be taken to shower facilities before being assigned housing. They were told to remember which hook they hung their clothes on, because they would need to retrieve them afterward. They were taken to buildings that looked like shower facilities. They were not shower facilities. Pilecki had been inside Auschwitz for nearly 2 years. He had sent out 10 detailed intelligence reports. He had documented everything he could see and calculate. He had watched the smoke rise from the buildings at the edge of the camp each time a transport arrived. He had received word, through his underground channels, that his reports had reached London. He was still waiting for someone to act on them. The trains kept coming. September 1940, his first night in Auschwitz. The barracks were wooden structures built for a fraction of the number of men they now held. Men slept stacked on shelves, 3 to a surface barely wide enough for one. The smell inside was difficult to describe and impossible to forget. The man next to Pilecki was shaking, not from cold, though it was already cold. He was shaking because he had no way to process, in the span of a single afternoon, the distance between the life he had been living that morning and the place he now found himself. Pilecki lay on the wooden board and thought about his problem clearly. He needed to find one person he could trust without being obvious about looking. He needed to appear to be exactly what his prisoner number said he was. Tomasz Serafiński, civilian, arrested at random, learning like everyone else what the rules were. He could not ask directly. He could not reveal what he was doing. He had to read people in conditions specifically designed to make reading people impossible, because everyone inside those fences was afraid. And fear looks like many things, and not all of them are deception. His first contact was a man named Władysław Daring, a doctor who had arrived on the same transport from Warsaw. Within the first week, Pilecki had identified Daring as someone who had not yet broken, who was observing the camp with the same systematic attention Pilecki was using, and who was using the knowledge he gathered to help other prisoners staying alive rather than to gain personal advantage. That combination, analytical under pressure, with the instinct to protect rather than exploit, was the profile Pilecki was looking for. He approached Daring quietly over several days with small acts of practical help. He did not propose the organization immediately. He waited until he had established a baseline of trust, then spoke plainly. By October, there were 2 of them. By December, there were 5. He structured the network as a series of 5-person cells. Each member knew only the people in their own cell. If the Gestapo arrested one person and broke them, the damage was contained within those 5. No single person in the organization could give up more than a handful of names. Pilecki himself knew everything, which meant that if he was ever identified, the entire network was exposed, which was a fact he carried with him every hour of every day for 2.5 years. To survive Auschwitz long enough to build anything required a set of adaptations that are nearly impossible to explain from the outside. The official ration for prisoners was approximately 1,500 calories per day. The labor required of them burned considerably more than that. Men lost weight rapidly, and past a certain threshold, the body begins consuming itself. Prisoners who reached this state were called muscle men by the other inmates, people who had stopped resisting internally, who had disconnected from the present, who were dying without yet having died. Pilecki observed this process in others and understood what it looked like in its early stages, which meant he could sometimes intervene before it was too late, and sometimes he could only watch. When a prisoner died, his food ration did not disappear immediately in the chaos of the camp's administration. Pilecki organized the routing of those calories to members of the network who needed them most. Through doctors in the organization, he arranged minimal but real medical attention for sick members who would otherwise have been left to deteriorate. He organized a system of information sharing about when selections for execution were likely, so that people who appeared too weakened could be temporarily assigned to different work details. In the evenings, in the barracks, after the light was officially out, prisoners taught each other. A professor conducted lectures in mathematics. A lawyer led discussions of philosophy and history. This sounds impossible in context, and in context it was. Pilecki understood that this was not supplementary to survival. It was survival. The thing Auschwitz was designed to destroy was not the body first. It was the interior of the person, the sense that one existed as a thinking, purposeful being, rather than as a number assigned to a function. The education in the barracks at night Was the resistance saying, "We are still here, and we still know things, and that knowledge still matters"? He never told the participants that the sessions were organized by an underground network. Most of them believed it was spontaneous, which in a way it was. In July of 1941, a prisoner escaped from Auschwitz. This was the rule. For every man who escaped, 10 men would be selected and starved to death in a punishment bunker. The selection was made in the yard, in front of the assembled prisoners, which was the point. The SS commander walked down the line and chose 10 men. One of those selected was a man named Franciszek Kajowniczek. When his number was called, he cried out. He said, "My wife, my children." A prisoner stepped forward out of the line. His name was Maximilian Kolbe. He was a Catholic priest. He was 50 years old. He looked at the SS commander and said, "I am a Catholic priest. I want to take his place. He has a wife and children." The SS commander Fritsch stared at him. This request did not fit any category in the procedural logic of the camp. He told Kolbe to step into the line of 10. He sent Kajowniczek back. Kolbe was placed in the starvation bunker with 9 other men. He survived for 2 weeks. He outlasted everyone else. On August 14th, 1941, a guard entered the bunker and injected him with carbolic acid. He died immediately. Kajowniczek lived to be 93 years old. He attended Kolbe's canonization as a saint in 1982. He spent the rest of his life telling people what had happened in that yard. Pilecki was standing in the assembled prisoner formation when Kolbe stepped forward. He never described, in any of his surviving writing, exactly what he felt in that moment. He was not a man who wrote about his own feelings in the middle of operations, but the story of Kolbe's act appears in his reports, documented with the same precision as the mortality statistics and the camp layout and the gas chamber construction timeline. He noted it. He made sure it got out. His reports were precise, almost clinical documents. This was deliberate. He had considered the problem of how to make people believe information that was, by any ordinary standard, unbelievable. He had decided that emotional language would allow readers to dismiss the reports as propaganda or exaggeration. He described what he had observed as an engineer describes a mechanism. He wrote about the gas chambers using the vocabulary of industrial process because he understood that was what they were, an industrial process. He calculated the number of people being killed per day, using the same methods he would have used to calculate crop yields on his farm. He later said that writing those reports was the most difficult thing he did inside the camp. Not the physical danger of getting them out. The act of translating what he was witnessing into flat, verifiable, credible language, while the things he was describing continued to happen around him. The reports left the camp through multiple channels. Released prisoners carried pages folded into the linings of clothing. Civilian construction workers who entered the camp during the expansion projects moved information across the perimeter in exchange for nothing, or in exchange for everything, depending on how you counted the risk they were taking. Some of them were caught. The records show what happened to the ones who were caught. The reports that got through were encrypted and transmitted by the Polish Underground Command in Warsaw to the Polish government in exile in London. From London, they reached British intelligence. From British intelligence, they were distributed to Allied governments. The Americans received them. The British received them. Multiple reports over multiple years, describing Auschwitz in precise operational detail, including the gas chambers and the scale of the killing. By late 1942, Pilecki had been inside Auschwitz for over 2 years. He had built a network of 500 people inside the most dangerous facility in occupied Europe. He had documented the largest systematic murder in human history and transmitted the evidence to every relevant Allied authority. And he had been waiting long enough and watching the trains arrive long enough to understand something that changed the nature of every calculation he had made to get to this point. He had assumed the problem was information. He had assumed that if the right people knew what was happening, they would act, because the alternative was to know and to do nothing. And he was not able to conceive of that as a real outcome. He was beginning to conceive of it. The reports had arrived. The people who received them understood what they contained. The trains were still coming. The smoke was still rising, and no one was coming. He started thinking about a different option. If no one outside was coming to stop this, then the only people who could stop it were already inside. He began planning an uprising. April 26th, 1943, 2 in the morning. The camp bakery, Auschwitz. 3 prisoners were still inside after the shift had ended. The guards assumed they had left with the others. This assumption was accurate for 944 days of Witold Pilecki's time in the camp. On the 945th night, it was not accurate. Pilecki and 2 men from his network, a doctor named Edward Ciesielski and a Polish officer named Jan Redzej, had stayed behind deliberately. They had chosen Easter night for reasons that were partly practical and partly the kind of thing that does not reduce to practicality. Pilecki cut the telephone line to the guardhouse. Then he cut the lock on a storage room door with a tool they had been keeping hidden for this purpose for several months. They moved through the bakery to an exterior door. Beyond the door was open ground, then wire, then darkness. A guard on the perimeter noticed movement. He fired. The shots went wide. The 3 men ran. They ran through fields, through a forest, through darkness so complete that they navigated partly by sound. Behind them, the alarm began. Searchlights swept the perimeter. Dogs were released. They could hear both. They kept running. By morning, they were several kilometers from the camp, hidden in undergrowth near a stream. Ciesielski was bleeding from a cut sustained during the fence crossing. They had no food. They had a rough map drawn from memory and a series of contact addresses memorized. Nothing else. They had been planning this escape for months. They had not planned extensively for the emotional fact of actually being outside the wire after nearly 3 years inside, because that was not the kind of planning that would have helped. Pilecki lay in the undergrowth and breathed. It took them 2 weeks to reach the Polish resistance network south of Krakow. They traveled mostly at night. They slept in barns and forest clearings, and once in the basement of a farmhouse, where an elderly woman fed them without asking any of the questions she clearly had. They walked approximately 150 kilometers through occupied territory, while every German garrison in southern Poland had their descriptions. By mid-May, they had reached the town of Nowy Wisnitz, where resistance contacts took them in, gave them civilian clothes and forged papers, and let them rest. Pilecki rested for approximately 48 hours. Then he began to write. The document he produced over the following months became known as the Witold Report. It was nearly 100 pages long. It contained precise descriptions of the camp's physical layout, guard rotations, prisoner population, mortality rates, calculated from intake numbers, the construction timeline of the gas chambers, the operational details of the killing process, the categories of prisoners being transported in, and estimates of the total number of people already dead. He had been composing it in fragments in his head for nearly 3 years. He wrote in complete sentences from the first day. There were almost no corrections in the manuscript. The report described the original camp for Polish prisoners. It described the arrival and systematic murder of Soviet prisoners of war in 1941, the first use of Zyklon B gas, which had been originally tested on a group of 600 Soviet POWs locked in an underground bunker in September of that year. It described the expansion of the camp, the construction of Birkenau, the dedicated extermination facility adjacent to the original camp, capable of processing thousands of people per day. It described the arrival of Jewish transports from across occupied Europe, the selection process on the platform, the deception used to move people to the gas chambers without resistance. It described, in clinical language, with numerical estimates wherever he could calculate them, what the purpose of the facility was and what it was accomplishing. When the report was complete, he handed it to his Polish underground commanding officer in Warsaw. His commanding officer read it and forwarded it, encrypted, to the Polish government in exile in London. This government, which had no country, because Germany and the Soviet Union had divided it between them, received the report and understood its contents. They forwarded it to the British government. They forwarded it to the American government. They attached a specific request: bomb the railway lines leading to Auschwitz, not the camp itself, which risked killing prisoners. The railway infrastructure, the single rail junction at a town called Auschwitz, without which the trains carrying people from across Europe could not arrive. Destroy that junction and the killing slows. Destroy it repeatedly and the operational capacity of the extermination process collapses. This was not a complicated military ask. Allied bombers were already flying over that region of southern Poland by 1944. Before Pilecki's report arrived, a Polish diplomat and resistance courier named Jan Karski had already carried eyewitness testimony about the Holocaust to the West. Karski was not a prisoner who had escaped. He was an operative who had deliberately entered the Warsaw Ghetto and a transit camp at Izbika Lubelska to witness conditions firsthand. He then traveled to London and Washington and delivered his testimony personally to the most powerful men in the Western world. He met with the British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden. Eden thanked him for the information. He met with Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, an American Jew. Frankfurter listened to the entire account, then sat in silence for a moment, then said, "I cannot believe you." He added, "I did not say you are lying. I said, I cannot believe you. There is a difference." He met with President Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt asked Karski how the horses in Poland were being treated. Karski returned to Europe and reported that no action would be taken. This was before Pilecki's report reached the same offices. It was before multiple additional intelligence assessments from multiple additional sources confirmed the same facts through different channels. It was before the Allied aerial reconnaissance photographs taken during bombing missions over the Buna synthetic rubber plant in 1944 were developed and examined. On to other assessments. In 1944, Allied onto other assessments. In 1944, Allied bombers were conducting regular raids on the IG Farben-Buna industrial complex, less than 5 miles from Auschwitz-Birkenau. The aircraft that flew those missions passed directly over the camp. The aircrews could see it. Some of them later described seeing the smoke. The Polish government in exile continued forwarding requests to bomb the rail lines. In August of 1944, the Assistant Secretary of War of the United States, John McCloy, sent an official reply to the World Jewish Congress, which had made the same request through diplomatic channels. He wrote that bombing the railways or the camp itself would be, in his words, impracticable due to the distance and would divert considerable air support essential to the success of our forces currently engaged in decisive operations elsewhere. At the time that letter was written, American heavy bombers had already completed a successful raid on the Buna plant 5 miles away on August 20th. They returned on September 13th, on December 18th, on December 26th. The rail junction at Auschwitz was never targeted. Between May and July of 1944, 437,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz on those rail lines. The majority were murdered within hours of arrival. They were the last large transport before liberation. The railway infrastructure that moved them to the camp was not bombed. It was not bombed because it was not ordered to be bombed. It was not ordered to be bombed because the people with the authority to give that order received the information and chose to apply it differently than Pilecki had assumed they would. He was in Warsaw when he finally understood this. He had spent 945 days inside a death camp on the premise that if the people with power received precise, verifiable, comprehensive information about what was happening, they would act. This was not a naive assumption. It was a logical one. He had based it on a model of human decision-making in which knowledge, properly transmitted, would produce a proportionate response. The model was wrong. The knowledge had been transmitted. The response was letters, explaining why a response was impracticable. He thought about the 500 people in his network still inside the camp. He thought about the trains still arriving. He thought about the fact that he was outside and free and in possession of every piece of information he had set out to gather, and that none of it had produced what he had walked into Auschwitz to produce. He sat with this for a period he did not record. Then he did what the evidence suggested was the only remaining option. He picked up a rifle and went to the Warsaw Uprising. September 1944, Warsaw. From the upper floors of a ruined building in the city center, Polish soldiers fighting the Warsaw Uprising could look east and see the far bank of the Vistula River. They could see campfires, Soviet campfires. The Red Army, at that point, the largest land force ever assembled in human history, was sitting on the eastern bank of the Vistula and watching Warsaw burn, not from a distance, not from somewhere else entirely, from across the river. Polish soldiers who paused the fighting long enough to look could see the silhouettes of Soviet soldiers moving around those fires in the dark. The Soviets had been there for weeks. They were not coming. To understand what Pilecki was doing in Warsaw in August of 1944, you have to understand what he was not doing in August of 1944. He was not inside Auschwitz. He had escaped 16 months earlier. He was not in hiding. He had spent those months in Warsaw, writing his report, meeting with resistance commanders, and operating as a free man in an occupied city. which is not the same as being safe, but is categorically different from being a prisoner. He had done more in his life to that point than any reasonable version of duty could require. He had volunteered for a concentration camp, survived nearly 3 years inside it, built a 500-person underground organization, documented the Holocaust in real time, escaped, and transmitted the information to every Allied government. He owed nothing more to anyone. On August 1st, 1944, the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising. 60,000 Polish fighters, most of them civilians with weapons, rose against the German occupiers in a coordinated assault across the city. The plan was to liberate Warsaw before the Soviet forces arrived, to establish Polish control of the capital, and thereby negotiate from a position of strength in the post-war political settlement. The operation was given the code name Tempest. Pilecki did not have to join it. He was not under orders to join it. He joined it. He later explained his thinking briefly, without drama. He wrote, "I had to be where Poland was fighting." This was not a complicated calculation for him. It was the same calculation he had been making since 1939. The fighting was where it was. He was where he was. The question of whether to go was not a question he spent significant time on. He was assigned to the KDW unit of the Home Army and fought in the Mokotów district during the first weeks of the uprising, then in the city center, as the German counterattack compressed the Polish lines. The fighting inside Warsaw during those 63 days was unlike anything that had happened in a Western city in the 20th century. The Germans deployed SS units and Wehrmacht divisions supported by artillery, aircraft, and tanks. Against them were Polish fighters, many of them teenagers, armed with whatever the underground had been able to accumulate over 5 years of occupation. Some rifles, some captured German weapons, home-manufactured grenades, a handful of machine guns. What they had that the Germans did not have was the buildings themselves. They fought room to room, floor to floor, sewer tunnel to sewer tunnel. They held sections of the city far longer than the German commanders expected a force with that level of equipment could hold anything. The German commander, Heinrich Himmler, ordered specific units to carry out mass reprisals against civilians while the fighting continued. In the Wola district, in the first days of August, SS and Wehrmacht soldiers executed approximately 50,000 civilians in a span of a week. They moved through the streets and killed everyone they found: women, elderly men, patients in hospitals, children. Pilecki was fighting in a different part of the city. He heard about Wola afterward. He wrote nothing in any surviving document about what he felt when he heard. He kept his accounts operational. Positions held, positions lost, numbers of fighters. This was the same discipline he had applied to his Auschwitz reports. Whether this discipline cost him something, or protected him, or both, is not something he recorded. The Soviets had reached the eastern bank of the Vistula on the morning of August 1st, the same day the uprising began. What happened next has been documented from the Soviet archives opened after the Cold War, and it removes any ambiguity about what Stalin intended. Stalin knew the uprising was coming. He had intelligence on the Polish Home Army's plans. He had allowed his forces to advance to the Vistula and then issued orders to halt. He then made 2 decisions that sealed the uprising's fate. He refused to coordinate Soviet military action with the Polish forces inside Warsaw, and he refused to allow Allied aircraft to use Soviet airfields to deliver supplies to the fighters in the city. Without Soviet airfields as refueling points, British and American aircraft attempting supply drops over Warsaw had to fly from bases in Italy or Britain, a round trip of such length that the aircraft could carry minimal cargo and in some cases could not make the return flight. The supply operation was close to useless under those conditions. Stalin's public position was that the Warsaw Uprising was, in his words, a reckless and terrible adventure, and its organizers were power-hungry criminals. In diplomatic communications, he told Churchill and Roosevelt that Soviet forces were unable to advance due to operational circumstances. The operational circumstances were orders from Stalin telling them not to advance. The Soviet campfires burned on the East Bank. Warsaw burned on the West Bank. Polish soldiers looked across the river at night and understood, if they had not understood before, something about the nature of the choice that had actually been made for them. On September 18th, 1944, 6 weeks into the uprising, Stalin finally permitted Allied aircraft to use Soviet airfields. He made this concession because by that point, most of Warsaw's defensive positions had already fallen. The outcome was determined, and the gesture cost him nothing. The uprising ended on October 2nd, 1944. The Polish Home Army Command surrendered to preserve the lives of the remaining civilian population. Approximately 200,000 people were dead. Most of them were not fighters. Hitler's response to the surrender included a direct order. Warsaw was to be leveled, specifically and completely. SS demolition teams moved through the already destroyed city and brought down whatever was still standing, block by block, building by building, until the city that had existed for 700 years was 85% rubble. Pilecki surrendered with the other Home Army soldiers. Under the terms of the capitulation agreement, officers of the Polish Home Army were to be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. The Germans honored this. He was transported to a prisoner of war camp, first to Stalag 17A at Kaisersteinbrück, then later to Oflag 7A at Murnau in Germany. He had spent nearly 3 years as a prisoner in Auschwitz under conditions designed to kill him systematically. He now spent several months in a German prisoner of war camp, operating under Geneva Convention rules. The food was insufficient by civilian standards. The conditions were difficult. He later described the camp in writing. He did not describe it as difficult. April 29th, 1945. American forces of the 12th Armored Division reached Murnau. The gates of the camp opened. Pilecki walked out. He was 43 years old. He had survived Auschwitz. He had survived the Warsaw Uprising. He had survived German prisoner of war camps. He had survived the Second World War. The war in Europe ended 8 days later. The officers and men freed from Murnau joined the Polish Second Corps, the Polish military force that had been fighting under British command throughout the Italian campaign. The corps was commanded by General Władysław Anders, and it was, at the end of the war, one of 4 possible futures for a Polish soldier who did not want to return to a Poland now controlled by the Soviet Union. The options were roughly as follows: stay with Anders' corps in the West and eventually settle in Britain, where a Polish community was already forming. Emigrate elsewhere, wait and see, or go home. Anders himself told his officers not to return, not yet, possibly not ever. He understood what was happening in Poland. The Soviets had installed a communist government. The NKVD, the Soviet Security Service, was systematically arresting and executing leaders of the Polish Home Army, the same organization Pilecki had served in, the same network he had been part of since 1939, was being treated by the new government as an enemy organization. Officers who returned were disappearing into prisons or being found shot. Pilecki knew this. Multiple people told him this directly. He had not seen his wife Maria in 5 years. He had not seen his son Andrei or his daughter Zofia since the morning he walked into a German street roundup and allowed himself to be taken to Auschwitz. Andrei was now 17. Zofia was now 14. He also believed that Poland needed people like him more than it needed people like him to be safe. In the autumn of 1945, Witold Pilecki returned home. In early 1948, Witold Pilecki was in a prison in Warsaw, waiting for his trial. His son Andrei was allowed to visit him. Andrei was 20 years old. He had not seen his father for most of the war. He had grown up as the son of a man who was simultaneously doing the most important thing, happening anywhere in occupied Europe, and completely invisible to his own family. They sat across from each other in a prison room. Pilecki had been in custody for 9 months. 9 months of interrogation. 9 months of what the Communist Security Service called investigation. Andrei asked his father how he was being treated. Pilecki thought for a moment and then said, "Auschwitz was nothing compared to this. This is a real statement." It was reported by Andrei and preserved in testimony. The man who had endured nearly 3 years in Auschwitz, who had watched people die around him every day, who had organized resistance in a camp designed to kill him, looked at his son and said that the thing he was currently experiencing was worse. Let that settle before continuing. He had come home in the autumn of 1945. Everyone who knew what Poland was becoming had told him not to. General Anders had told him not to. The intelligence officers attached to the Polish Corps in the West had told him not to. The pattern was already clear by then. Polish Home Army officers who returned to Soviet-controlled Poland were being arrested by the Communist Security Service, the UB, on charges of anti-state activity. Some were executed. Some disappeared into the prison system. The new Polish government, installed by Stalin and dependent on Soviet support for its survival, considered the Home Army not as the organization that had fought Germany for 6 years, but as a political threat that needed to be neutralized. Pilecki went home. He went home because his wife, Maria, was there. His daughter, Zofia, was there. And he went home because he had identified, from the West, a situation that looked exactly like the situation he had identified in 1940 when he looked at Auschwitz and decided someone needed to be inside, documenting what was happening. He went home to document it. Within weeks of returning, he was working for the Polish government in exile's intelligence network. His assignment, which he had largely designed himself, was to gather systematic information on Soviet and communist activities inside Poland. The arrests of Home Army officers, the elimination of independent political parties, the methods used to suppress opposition, the structure of the Soviet intelligence presence in the country. He used the same methodology he had used in Auschwitz. He built networks of trusted contacts. He gathered information in fragments and synthesized it into reports. He was precise and systematic. He calculated what he could not directly observe from what he could. He was building another dossier. The subject was different. The method was identical. The The Communist Security Service was watching him. They had been watching him since shortly after his return. The UB had informers throughout the circles Pilecki moved in. They built a file on him through 1946 and into 1947. They knew what he was doing. They waited until they had enough documentation to construct the charges they wanted, and then they moved. May 8, 1947. Officers of the UB arrested Witold Pilecki in Warsaw. What happened to him between May 1947 and his trial in March 1948 is documented partly through his own testimony at trial, partly through accounts from fellow prisoners, and partly through the records that became available after the fall of communism in 1989. The man responsible for conducting his interrogation was Józef Rozański, the head of the investigative department of the Ministry of Public Security. Rozański was known for methods that had no constraints. There was no Geneva Convention that applied inside a communist security prison. There was no Red Cross inspection. There were no rules about what could be done to a prisoner to extract what was needed. Pilecki had survived Auschwitz. He had survived the Warsaw Uprising. He had survived German prisoner of war captivity. None of that was what he told his son. Auschwitz was nothing compared to. What changed in the communist prison was not the physical severity, although accounts suggest it was extreme. What changed was the nature of who was doing it. The SS guards in Auschwitz were enemies. This was clear and consistent. The men torturing him in Warsaw were Poles. They were members of the state he had spent 6 years risking his life to preserve. He was being destroyed by the country he had entered Auschwitz to save. This appears to be what he meant. His trial began on March 3, 1948. The charges were illegal crossing of the state border, use of forged documents, carrying weapons without authorization, gathering information that could be used by foreign imperialist powers against Poland. The foreign imperialist power in question was the Polish government in exile in London. The legitimate government of Poland, which had governed the country before the war and continued to be recognized by Western democracies, was categorized in the indictment as a hostile foreign power. Pilecki was not permitted to call witnesses. Evidence he wished to present in his defense was ruled inadmissible. The trial lasted 3 days. When given the opportunity to speak on his own behalf, he did not offer excuses. He did not claim the charges were false. He said that everything he had done for Poland, and that he had no regrets about any of it. The court sentenced him to death. He was allowed to write a final letter. He wrote to his wife, Maria. He wrote to his children. The contents of these letters were confiscated by prison authorities before they could be delivered. His family never received them. May 25, 1948. The basement of Mokotów prison in Warsaw. Witold Pilecki was executed by a single shot to the back of the head. He was 46 years old. His body was not returned to his family. His family was not told where he was buried. The prison records were falsified or destroyed. The communist government classified all documentation related to his case. His name was removed from public record. Books that mentioned him were censored. His existence as a person who had done what he had done became, officially, a fact that Poland did not acknowledge. Maria Pilecka applied repeatedly through official channels to learn where her husband was buried. She received no response. Zofia Pilecka, his daughter, later joined the efforts to locate his remains. She spent decades pursuing the question. She died in 2009 without an answer. The communist Polish government fell in 1989. Files were opened. Researchers began working through the records. Pilecki was officially rehabilitated in 1990, 42 years after his execution. In 2006, he was posthumously promoted to the rank of colonel. In 2013, Poland awarded him the Order of the White Eagle, the highest honor the Polish state can bestow. Andrzej Pilecki, his son, was alive to receive the order on his father's behalf. The place where Witold Pilecki is buried remains unknown. Forensic teams have excavated sites in and around Warsaw, where prisoners were known to have been buried by the communist government. They have recovered remains. In some cases, those remains have been identified. In other cases, they have not. Pilecki's remains have not been definitively located. The land under Warsaw holds many people who were put there without markers and without any intention that they be found. There is a question that Pilecki's life poses that does not have a comfortable answer. He entered Auschwitz voluntarily in 1940 because he believed that if the right information reached the right people, something would be done. The right information reached the right people. Nothing was done. The trains kept coming. He came back to Poland in 1945 because he believed that if someone documented what was happening under Soviet occupation, that documentation would eventually matter. He was arrested while documenting it. The documentation was confiscated. He was executed. Both times, he was right about the facts. The facts did not change the outcome. He was not a man who gave up on the connection between truth and consequence. He went back to exactly the same method twice, in two different situations, against two different enemies, and in both cases, the method worked technically and failed completely. The information was correct. The documentation was precise. It reached people with power. None of it produced what he intended it to produce in the time he had. He died with the second dossier, unfinished, in the hands of the people who killed him. What does a person do with that? The question is not rhetorical. Pilecki was a man who answered it twice, in practice, with his life. He answered it the same way both times. He picked up what he had, and he went to the next place where work needed to be done. Maybe this is the thing that makes his story impossible to completely understand from a comfortable distance. He knew, by 1945, what information alone could and could not do. He went back to Poland anyway. He was not naive by that point. He had watched the Allies receive his reports and bomb a rubber factory 5 miles from the gas chambers. He had watched the Soviets watch Warsaw burn from across a river. He went home. He started the next file. There is no version of this story in which Witold Pilecki is saved by the thing he believed in. There is only the record of what he built, twice, in conditions specifically designed to make building anything impossible, and the fact that we know what happened in Auschwitz in precise and verifiable detail, because one man went there on purpose to write it down. His grave is a field somewhere under Warsaw. His file is in the historical record of every country that was told and chose not to act. Both of these things are true simultaneously. That is the whole story. September 19th, 1940. Warsaw. A German patrol had sealed off a block in the Zolibor district and was conducting a street roundup. This was routine by now. The occupiers did it regularly. They would appear without warning, encircle a neighborhood, and take every man they could find. No reason required, no trial, No destination announced. Every person in Warsaw knew what to do when this happened. You got off the street. You went inside. You stayed completely still and completely quiet, and you waited for it to be over. One man walked directly into the cordon. He was 38 years old. He was dressed like an ordinary civilian. He carried identity papers in the name of Tomasz Serafiński, a name the Germans had no file on. He had spent several weeks choosing this particular roundup, on this particular street, because he knew exactly where the prisoners from this sweep would be sent. He let the soldiers stop him. He let them process him. He let them load him onto a truck. His real name was Witold Pilecki. He was a Polish cavalry officer, an underground resistance organizer, a husband and a father of 2 children. He was not out of options. He was not cornered. He was not desperate. He had volunteered for this. He was on his way to Auschwitz, and he had a plan for what he was going to do once he got there. To understand Witold Pilecki, you need to start with his grandfather. In 1863, his grandfather Joseph took part in the January Uprising, a Polish rebellion against Russian rule. The uprising lasted 18 months. When it was over, the Russians sentenced Joseph to 7 years of forced labor in Siberia. He survived. He came back. He never apologized for what he had done. In the Pilecki family, this was not presented as a cautionary tale. It was presented as the standard. Witold grew up in a household shaped by that story. He was educated, artistic, the kind of man who painted canvases and read widely, and also happened to be a trained cavalry officer who had fought in the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. After the war, he settled in the Sukoce region, managed a farm, and built what looked from the outside like a quiet, ordinary life. He married a woman named Maria. They had 2 children, a son named Andrei and a daughter named Sofia. People who knew him before the war used the same word repeatedly when they tried to describe him. Calm, not the passivity of someone who does not care deeply about things, but something closer to the stillness of someone who has already decided what matters and does not need to keep deciding it. He was also, by the accounts of everyone who worked with him, someone who looked at a problem and skipped immediately to the question of what could actually be fixed, rather than spending time on what he wished were fixable. This habit of mind is what led him to Auschwitz. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. The Soviet Union invaded from the east 16 days later. Poland fell in 5 weeks. Within months, German troops had imposed an occupation whose logic was not simply control, but elimination. They were systematically arresting Polish officers, priests, professors, judges, and anyone else they identified as a potential source of organized resistance. They were shooting them in forests and city squares. They were sending them to prisons and camps. By November 1939, just 2 months after the collapse, Pilecki had already co-founded a clandestine military organization in Warsaw. He was operating under a false identity, recruiting members, building networks. He was doing effective, dangerous, necessary work. Then, in the summer of 1940, information began reaching the underground about a camp the Germans had built near the town of Oswiecim, 40 miles west of Krakow. The Germans called it Auschwitz. It had opened in June 1940 and was being used, initially, to hold Polish political prisoners. The fragments coming out of the camp were difficult to process. Of the first 728 Polish men sent to Auschwitz in June 1940, more than half were dead by September. not from executions, not yet, but from the conditions themselves, the labor, the rations, the deliberate, systematic destruction of human beings through work and starvation. Guards beat prisoners to death for minor infractions. Men were hanged in the yard for others to watch. The camp was designed not to hold people, but to consume them. Pilecki knew this. He knew the survival rate. He understood what the inside of that place looked like. He went to his commanding officer in the underground, a man named Jan Vlodakiewicz, and told him he wanted to go in voluntarily. He would get himself arrested, be processed as a prisoner under a false name, and build a resistance organization from inside the camp. He would establish communication channels to the outside. He would gather detailed intelligence on what was happening, and he would lay the groundwork for a possible prisoner uprising if an opportunity arose. Vlodakiewicz stared at him. He asked if Pilecki understood that once he was inside, there was essentially no way to guarantee extraction, that if his real identity was discovered, he would be tortured and shot, that even if he was never discovered, the odds of simple survival were brutally low. Pilecki said he understood. Vlodakiewicz approved the mission. He was the only one who knew the truth of where Pilecki was going. Pilecki came home. He sat down with his wife Maria and told her he had a mission. He could not tell her where, or for how long, or what exactly it involved. The less she knew, the safer she was. If the Gestapo ever came to this apartment and asked Maria Pilecka where her husband was, the safest answer she could give them was that she genuinely did not know. She looked at him for a long time. She had married this man. She had watched him build an underground network in an occupied city for the past 10 months. She understood, at some level, the kind of person he was and the kinds of choices that kind of person makes. She did not ask him to stop. Then Andrei and Zofia came in. Andrei was 12 years old. Zofia was 9. Pilecki told them he had to go away for work. Andrei asked when he would be back. Pilecki looked at his son and said he was not sure. Zofia asked him to bring her something when he came home. He told her he would try. He kissed them both. He picked up Zofia and held her for a moment, then set her down. He put his hand on Andrei's shoulder. He looked at both of his children. Then he walked out the door. He could not tell them the truth. If the Germans arrested one of them, if they tortured the children to find the father, what they did not know could not be extracted. The lie was protection. The lie was love. He never told them he was going to Auschwitz. He never told them he had chosen to go.